Maria Alvarez moved through the bustling military base cafeteria with practiced precision, balancing a tray stacked high with steaming plates of food. The scent of roasted meat, gravy, and fresh bread mingled with the tang of cleaning supplies and polished floors. Generals and high-ranking officers sat in their neat rows, discussing troop movements, logistics, and the endless grind of strategy meetings, while she moved quietly among them. To the men at those tables, Maria was just another worker, another face behind a plain apron and a cap. Invisible, she accepted it with the kind of calm born from years of being overlooked. Her footsteps were quiet but deliberate, each one echoing softly against the linoleum floor. Her dark hair, pulled tightly into a bun beneath her cap, framed a face that had seen too much and carried it like a secret. Her eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the tables for empty cups and requests. Every morning she arrived before dawn, slipping into the kitchen like a shadow. She knew the routine intimately, the clanging of dishes, the hiss of the coffee machines, the faint chatter that always carried from the seating area. It was predictable, ordered, safe. A far cry from the chaos she had endured overseas. Maria's memories weren't far behind her. Even as she refilled a general's coffee cup, her mind drifted back to the sun-blasted deserts of Iraq. She could almost feel the hot sand burning her boots, the acrid smoke from a vehicle that had exploded moments before, the deafening rattle of gunfire all around her. Back then, she had been more than a cafeteria worker. She had been a combat medic, tasked with saving lives under conditions most could barely imagine. The silver star pinned quietly under her shirt was a faint reminder of what she had accomplished and what she had survived. The cafeteria, in contrast, was mundane. Stainless steel counters reflected fluorescent lights, trays clattered onto metal racks, and the smell of reheated vegetables mixed oddly with coffee and bleach. Generals, their crisp uniforms starched and spotless, leaned forward in conversation, gesturing to papers spread across tables. Their conversation, filled with words like logistics, operational readiness, and reconnaissance, seemed distant, almost abstract, compared to the visceral immediacy of the field she once knew. No one looked at Maria beyond a passing glance when she refilled drinks. They assumed she was a part of the scenery, an invisible thread in their orderly world. Yet Maria was not invisible. She was always alert, always aware. Her hands moved instinctively, guided by years of training and discipline. Each plate she carried, each cup she poured, was handled with care, precision honed in moments of life and death urgency. But unlike the battlefield, here her skill went unnoticed, unappreciated. Some days, it felt like a punishment. She could hear snatches of conversations from the table's comments about promotions, tactical errors, and budget cuts, but never about her. Never a word about the hero who had once braved hellish fire to save others. She had learned early that humility was survival. In Iraq, bragging about heroics could make you a target, or worse, create resentment among peers who had all given too much. So Maria had kept her medals hidden, her courage quiet. Now, those same instincts kept her silent in the cafeteria. The silver star, faint beneath her uniform, had become more than recognition. It was a talisman, a private acknowledgement of what she had endured and accomplished. No one here would ever understand, and she had long ago accepted that. Yet there were moments when the weight of invisibility pressed hard against her chest. Standing behind a table where a general sipped his coffee while complaining about a delayed shipment, she remembered the screams of soldiers pinned under burning metal, the smell of scorched earth and blood. She remembered the desperation, the terror, and the unyielding determination that had driven her to act despite fear. And she carried that memory silently, letting it shape her posture, her movements, and the quiet intensity in her eyes. A tray wobbled slightly in her hands as she approached a table of 3 officers. She smiled faintly, a practice gesture, and set down a plate of turkey with a soft, "Here you go, sir." One of the officers barely acknowledged her, muttering a distracted thanks. Maria's gaze flicked upward, noting the medals on their chests, a shine of authority in their eyes. It struck her how much difference a ribbon could make in the eyes of the world, how little weight her own carried here, hidden, ignored, and unspoken. She paused for a moment, allowing herself a fleeting thought. What would happen if someone recognized her? If the hint of the silver star beneath her shirt was noticed, would they treat her differently? Respect, she thought, could be fleeting and conditional, tied to appearances and rank rather than true courage. She doubted they could ever comprehend the reality of battle, the physical and mental toll it exacted, or the fear that never truly left you. A loud clatter from the dish return snapped her back to the present. She moved efficiently, collecting trays and plates with fluid motions. Her eyes scanned the room, noting the newest batch of recruits sitting wide-eyed at the corner tables. She remembered being one of them, unsure, untested, and terrified, thrust into chaos she had no control over. Perhaps this was why she remained quiet now, as someone mistook her stories for exaggeration, or worse, trivialized the sacrifices made. But even as she worked, Maria could feel the tension in the air. Generals leaned closer together, speaking in hushed tones, their expressions sharp. Occasionally, one of them would glance her way, as if sensing something beyond her apron, something not immediately visible. She caught these glances and met them briefly with a neutral expression. Her eyes gave nothing away. She had learned long ago that power could be subtle, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. And she had survived precisely because she knew when to reveal strength and when to hide it. For all the calm efficiency, there was a pulse of unease beneath the surface. Maria had lived through explosions, ambushes, and the wailing of soldiers who would not survive. The cafeteria was no battlefield, but the echoes of war were never far from her mind. Every plate, every tray, every polite nod she gave was a reminder of the contrast between survival and insignificance. In one world, she had been revered. In the other, overlooked. And yet, both required discipline, courage, and endurance. Maria paused briefly, leaning slightly against the counter, and let herself breathe. She glanced at the faint outline of her medal beneath the shirt, a small silver star glinting in the fluorescent light. It was a secret only she carried, a small spark of the woman she had once been. The cafeteria could not diminish her. The generals could not erase her past. And though she remained silent, invisible, the memory of courage coursing through her veins reminded her that she still mattered, if only she could find the right moment to be seen. Her hands moved again, delivering another tray to a table of officers deep in conversation. She balanced the plates as if they weighed nothing, but the memory of past burdens lent gravity to each movement. The generals chatted about operational readiness, troop morale, and supply lines, unaware of the hero standing before them. She smiled faintly, a secret smile only she understood. Beneath the uniform, beneath the apron, she was still the soldier who had faced fire without flinching. And one day, perhaps, someone would notice. Until then, Maria Alvarez carried trays, served meals, and remained invisible, but not defeated. She had survived the horrors of war, and she would endure this cafeteria. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Maria knew. Courage didn't vanish with reassignment. It lingered quietly, like the gleam of a hidden silver star beneath her shirt. And someday, someone would see it. Before the sterile, fluorescent-lit cafeteria, before the clatter of trays and the murmurs of generals, Maria Alvarez had existed in a world defined by heat, smoke, and the relentless percussion of gunfire. Iraq, 2006, a place that had burned its memory into her bones. Even now, sitting in the base kitchen, Those memories surged unbidden, vivid, and unrelenting. The smell of roasted meat and coffee stirred echoes of dust, sand, and blood. She could hear the screams of men pinned beneath burning vehicles, the staccato rattle of AK-47s, the explosion of a roadside bomb tearing through the earth as though it were made of paper. She remembered the convoy clearly. The sun had risen mercilessly over the horizon, a blistering orange that turned the desert into a furnace. She was riding in the second Humvee, scanning the horizon for threats, adrenaline surging through her veins. The soldiers in her unit were tense, fingers twitching on rifles, eyes darting across the horizon. Maria had trained for moments like this, yet nothing could fully prepare anyone for the chaos when hell broke loose. The first explosion knocked the laid vehicle off the road, sending twisted metal and fire into the air. The blast wave hit her Humvee like a battering ram, throwing her against the seatbelt, ears ringing. Instinct took over. She unbuckled, tumbled out, and sprinted toward the wreckage. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from the singular clarity of purpose. Men lay scattered, some conscious, some not. Flames licked at uniforms and flesh, black smoke curling upward. Bullets whizzed past her head. She felt the heat sear her arms as she grabbed the first wounded soldier, dragging him from the inferno while suppressing panic. The world narrowed to a single focus: get him out alive. One by one, she pulled soldiers from the burning vehicles, feeling the scorching metal burn her palms, hearing their screams, and smelling the acrid stench of smoke and blood. Sergeant Miller, a hulking man with a booming laugh in quieter times, was pinned beneath a crumpled Humvee door. Maria struggled to lift him, muscles screaming, but adrenaline granted impossible strength. Around her, the battlefield was a surreal mix of horror and clarity. She had no time to fear, no time to cry, only the relentless drive to save lives. She could hear the enemy firing in short bursts, bullets kicking up sand at her feet, but she refused to hesitate. Her training kicked in instinctively. She checked vitals, applied tourniquets, and yelled directions to the younger medics who had frozen in the chaos. Time blurred. Minutes felt like hours. She worked tirelessly, lifting, dragging, patching, and shouting over the noise. A blast knocked her to the ground again, disorienting her, but she sprang up immediately. The silver star that would later adorn her chest hadn't come from courage alone. It had been the result of sheer survival instinct, skill, and refusal to leave anyone behind. By the time reinforcements arrived, 6 men were alive because of her. 6 lives she had wrested from the jaws of death. But it hadn't been without cost. Her hands were blistered and bleeding, her body coated in soot and grime. Her ears still rang from the explosions, and every breath smelled of smoke and blood. She had seen the faces of men she couldn't save, etched forever into her mind. That memory was heavier than any medal. The silver star would recognize valor, but it could not erase grief, trauma, or the sleepless nights haunted by screams and the weight of bodies she had carried. Returning home was supposed to be a relief. The military had honored her bravery publicly, with cameras flashing and speeches made in sterile conference rooms. But home brought a different kind of battlefield, one without adrenaline, where the war continued in quiet, invisible ways. Her body bore scars, burns, shrapnel wounds. Joint pain had refused to fade. Her mind replayed explosions like a broken record. Sleep was elusive, and crowds felt suffocating. Her battlefield has shifted from sand and fire to grocery stores, sidewalks, and office buildings, each civilian interaction a subtle daily challenge to her sense of normalcy. She sought work wherever she could, desperate to find a place where her skills might matter, even if in a less dramatic way. A cafeteria job at the military base offered stability, a regular paycheck, and the comfort of familiar surroundings, but it came with invisibility. No one knew who she had been. No one acknowledged the woman who had stared death in the face while saving lives. At first, it was humiliating. Serving food to men in uniforms, some of whom might not even realize the magnitude of her past achievements, felt almost like penance. But over time, Maria found a strange peace in routine. It was orderly, predictable, and controllable. Yet her past was never far behind. Every clatter of trays, every sharp voice ordering coffee, reminded her of the need for discipline. Every glance from a general, every distracted nod, carried echoes of authority she had once faced in combat situations, albeit in a different form. Her training in the field had taught her to observe, anticipate, and act with precision. Even here, decades later, those instincts were alive. She moved with care, every step deliberate, every gesture precise. In some ways, the cafeteria had become a microcosm of the battlefield, chaos beneath the surface, discipline masking underlying tension. And then there were moments of unintended recognition. On rare occasions, someone would glance at her apron or her sleeves, noticing something different. A metal glint, a rigid stance, a gaze that held more than casual attentiveness. Those moments sent a jolt through Maria's chest. She had hidden the silver star beneath her uniform, choosing not to announce her past, but a fraction of it still shone, waiting for eyes sharp enough to notice. She wondered who might see it, who might recognize the story behind the glint of silver and understand the weight she carried. Maria's mind often returned to the men she had saved, and the ones she hadn't. Their faces lingered, vivid as photographs in her memory. She remembered Sergeant Miller laughing about ridiculous things during patrols, a reminder that humanity persisted even in hellish conditions. She remembered Private Hernandez, quiet and nervous, eyes wide with fear, who had survived because Maria had dragged him out moments before an explosion consumed his Humvee. Their gratitude had been immediate and raw, but fleeting, lost amidst the chaos of ongoing war. Recognition on the battlefield was rare, and survival demanded humility. Here, in the cafeteria, recognition was nearly non-existent. And yet, Maria carried the memory of those men like armor. Each tray she balanced, each coffee she poured, was a reminder that life could continue, even if subtly, after trauma. She moved between tables silently, observing generals debating strategy with the same intensity she had once felt dodging gunfire. The parallels were striking, though no one at the tables could see the connection. To them, she was invisible, a background fixture. But Maria had learned long ago that invisibility was not weakness. It was survival, discipline, and control. As she passed a table of senior officers, she caught a fleeting glimpse of herself in the polished surface of a serving counter. Her eyes met her reflection briefly, and she saw the lines of tension etched into her face. The weight of the past, the invisible burden of courage, and the quiet dignity of survival all met her gaze. She adjusted her posture, straightened her apron, and moved forward with steady hands, carrying trays and coffees like a soldier carrying a wounded comrade. Even here, the instincts remained. Even here, the fire of courage burned quietly beneath the surface. She moved to another table, balancing plates of roast beef and mashed potatoes, and paused for a fraction of a second. Beneath the sleeve of her uniform, the faint silver glint of the star caught the light. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it existed. Maria had chosen to hide it, not from shame, but from habit. She had learned long ago that valor didn't require validation from others. Yet there was a part of her that wondered, who would notice it? Who would see her for what she truly was? For now, no one did. Generals sipped coffee, muttered about operational readiness, and dismissed her presence entirely. Maria moved among them with quiet dignity, invisible but present, carrying her history silently as she had learned to do. Her hands were steady, her eyes sharp, and her mind alive with the echoes of past heroism. In this cafeteria, she was a ghost, a servant, and a soldier all at once. And though the world around her ignored the metal beneath her shirt, she carried it like a spark, a reminder that courage could survive even when unseen. The cafeteria hummed with the usual din of clattering trays and murmured conversation. Yet in Maria Alvarez's mind, time seemed to slow. She carried a tray of coffee and plates with her usual quiet precision, moving between tables with fluid, disciplined motions honed by years in the military. She noticed the usual glances from the general's occasional, distracted, dismissive, but nothing had changed. And yet, on this humid afternoon, something shifted. As she leaned over to pour coffee for a table of 3 high-ranking officers, her sleeve shifted slightly. For just a heartbeat, the glint of silver peeked from beneath the fabric. A fraction of light caught on the edge of the silver star pinned beneath her uniform, and in that instant, everything changed. One general froze mid-gesture, his fork hovering above his plate. His eyes locked onto the faint shimmer, a spark of recognition igniting deep in his gaze. Maria felt her heart tighten. That small glimmer of metal had existed under her shirt for months, unnoticed. She had hidden it carefully, beneath her apron and plain uniform, believing that valor did not need acknowledgement to exist. But now, someone had seen it. The realization hit her like a jolt of electricity. Panic, instinct, and caution surged through her simultaneously. Should she correct the misconception? Should she explain, deny, or simply remain quiet? Years of discipline and battlefield instinct told her to stay calm, to observe first. The general's eyes narrowed slightly, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to something heavier and understanding, an astonishment, a recognition that was almost tangible. "Is that?" He started, his voice low, careful. Maria's hands paused mid-pour. Every muscle tensed as she weighed her response. The room seemed to fall into suspended silence, even as the other officers continued their conversation unaware. She could feel the hum of fluorescent lights, the clatter of dishes fading, and the intense focus of someone finally seeing her, not as a cafeteria worker, not as a face in the crowd, but as the soldier she had been. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but steady, controlled. The word felt heavier than any weight she had carried in combat. "It's a silver star." A subtle ripple of shock passed across the table. The generals had no reason to doubt her, yet they had no expectation that the woman serving their lunches had ever stood in fire, bullets whipping past her face, dragging men from burning vehicles. One of them, a grizzled colonel with deep-set eyes, leaned forward slightly, studying her. "You saved lives?" he asked, voice low, almost reverent. Maria nodded, but offered little elaboration. Words had never captured the intensity of war, the immediacy of life and death. Her experiences were lived, not recounted. The pause that followed was almost unbearable. Maria could feel the weight of their attention pressing down, an invisible scrutiny that made her stomach tighten. For months she had been invisible, unseen, serving trays to men who had no inkling of her history. And now, in this moment, the scales had shifted. One gaze, one brief recognition, had altered everything. The generals leaned closer together, speaking in hushed tones, exchanging glances that Maria could not fully hear. Yet she sensed the realization spreading across the table, the dawning awareness of what she had endured. Memories surged in vivid, relentless waves. She saw Sergeant Miller pinned beneath a Humvee, the flames licking at his uniform, and remembered the burning metal searing her hands as she lifted him free. She remembered the terror in Private Hernandez's eyes, the way he clutched her arm as she dragged him from the wreckage, his screams blending with the explosions around them. She remembered the acrid smoke, the dust choking her lungs, the deafening roar of machine guns. And now, here, in the mundane fluorescent glow of a cafeteria, the past collided with the present, fragile but undeniable. The general's voice broke through her reverie. "Tell me about it," he said softly, almost hesitantly. Maria's pulse quickened. She had been trained to speak clearly under pressure, but this was not a battlefield. This was a room full of men who had never truly seen her. Should she speak? Should she reveal the weight of her experiences? Her instinct to protect herself warred with the need to be recognized, to be understood. Carefully, she began to recount fragments of the convoy ambush, her voice measured, steady, though the memories clawed at her mind. "The convoy was hit at dawn," she began, her tone calm but edged with intensity. "IEDs detonated, and the lead vehicle was destroyed. We were pinned, under fire from multiple directions. Soldiers were injured, some trapped in the wreckage. I moved from vehicle to vehicle, pulling them out, applying tourniquets, stabilizing them until help arrived." She paused, glancing at the general. He did not interrupt, his attention total, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "6 men survived because of that action," she continued, her words almost clinical, lacking the emotional flourish that would have dramatized it. "It wasn't about glory, it was about survival." The colonel leaned back slightly, rubbing his jaw. "6 lives? That's remarkable." His voice carried a weight Maria was unaccustomed to hearing from those who had always dismissed her. Around the table, the other generals began to look at her differently, their casual authority replaced by a dawning respect. Maria felt her pulse slow, not from relief, but from recognition. For the first time in months, perhaps years, someone had truly seen her. Her past, her courage, her sacrifices, all of it was acknowledged, if only quietly. Even as she spoke, Maria remained alert. Years in combat had taught her to read subtle cues, to anticipate reactions, to gauge the danger in each interaction. She noticed a flicker of envy in one officer's eyes, a mix of admiration and disbelief in another, and a rare, profound respect in the colonel's gaze. Each subtle reaction told a story, and Maria absorbed it all. She was no longer invisible, no longer background noise. In this moment, she had shifted from server to soldier, recognized not by rank, but by the undeniable truth of her actions. Her mind wandered briefly to the other soldiers she had lost, the ones she could not save. Their faces remained vivid, etched into memory with painful clarity. Recognition now carried a bittersweet weight. She could be acknowledged, celebrated even, yet the absence of those who had fallen would always temper any accolades. Still, she spoke because the story needed to be known. The bravery of those moments had been collective, shared among men who would never hear their own names spoken in reverence. Her voice carried fragments of all of them. The general nodded slowly. "Why? Why are you here, serving lunch?" he asked, almost whispering, as if afraid to shatter the reality of the moment. Maria smiled faintly, a practiced expression that masked the storm of emotion beneath. "Life doesn't always follow the battles we survive," she said quietly. After injuries, after discharge, this was work. It's steady, predictable. And I needed something normal. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The truth was simple, but profound. Courage didn't always lead to comfort, nor did survival guarantee recognition. Some battles were invisible, fought long after the last bullet had flown. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken acknowledgement. Maria's tray rested lightly in her hands, but the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. Generals who had been indifferent, even dismissive, now regarded her differently, their authority humbled by the recognition of true bravery. In their eyes, she was no longer just a cafeteria worker. She was a soldier, a survivor, a hero whose actions had transcended the mundanity of rank and title. Maria exhaled slowly, letting the tension slip from her shoulders. For months, she had carried her medal and her memories in quiet solitude, hidden beneath uniforms and routine. Now, someone had finally seen. Recognition was not her goal. She had never sought it, but its presence brought a quiet affirmation. A sense of justice, however, delayed. The room's ordinary sounds, the clatter of trays, the hum of conversation returned gradually, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. She was no longer invisible. The colonel spoke again, his voice firm yet gentle. "You have incredible courage, Maria. That is not something easily forgotten." Other generals nodded, some whispering questions, others simply observing with newfound respect. Maria offered minimal details, enough to satisfy curiosity without delving into every harrowing moment. Her restraint, her modesty, only heightened their admiration. She did not seek glory, yet in that moment, she had earned something far more profound: acknowledgement, respect, and the silent assurance that her past heroism had not gone unseen. As she retreated to the kitchen, the tray held slightly tighter, Maria allowed herself a brief internal smile. She had survived wars, both abroad and within herself. She had carried the weight of others' lives, of medals earned and unearned recognition, of pain and triumph. And now, in a fluorescent-lit cafeteria filled with high-ranking officers, someone had seen her. Not for her apron, her trays, or her role as a server, but for the courage she had always carried, quietly, invisibly, like the glimmer of a silver star beneath her uniform. Maria Alvarez stood behind the serving counter, her hands resting lightly on a tray as she tried to steady her pulse. The general's eyes, sharp and unwavering, remained fixed on her. Time for a moment slowed. The cafeteria, once a blur of mundane activity, seemed to fade into the background. Only the flicker of recognition in their expressions mattered, and the faint glimmer of the silver star beneath her uniform. She had carried it quietly for months, but now it had become a bridge between her hidden past and the men who had previously ignored her. The colonel who had first noticed her medal leaned forward, voice low, careful, almost reverent. "Tell me about it," he said. It was an invitation, a challenge, and a recognition all at once. Maria felt the familiar surge of adrenaline she had once known on battlefields far away. She had survived explosions, ambushes, and the unrelenting pressure of life-or-death decisions. Now, the battlefield had shifted to a room full of officers who demanded nothing less than truth. Her voice trembled briefly, but she steadied herself. "The convoy was ambushed at dawn," she began, her tone calm but edged with intensity. She described the early morning light that turned the desert sand into a furnace, the way their lead vehicle had exploded in a shower of fire and twisted metal. Each detail she recounted carried the weight of lived experience. The deafening crack of gunfire, the acrid smoke that burned her lungs, the cries of wounded men echoing across the sand. The generals listened, their expressions shifting from curiosity to astonishment, as the mundane cafeteria transformed into a mental tableau of war. Maria described moving from vehicle to vehicle, pulling soldiers from burning wreckage, applying tourniquets with precision, and stabilizing the critically injured while enemy fire raked the convoy. Her hands, she explained, had been scorched by heat, bruised by debris, but she continued, driven by the imperative to save lives. Each story was told with measured restraint. She avoided embellishment, focusing instead on the brutal reality. The generals leaned in, some whispering questions to one another, all sensing the extraordinary courage unfolding in real time. Her voice faltered only briefly as she recounted the moments of loss, the soldiers she could not save despite her efforts. Their faces remained vivid in her memory. The young private who had panicked when a Humvee overturned, the corporal who had called her name in the chaos, the silent bravery of those too afraid to scream. She described the weight of their bodies, The burning heat of the sand beneath her knees, the stench of smoke and blood that clung to everything. These were not tales of heroics meant to glorify herself. They were fragments of truth, lived in the most extreme conditions imaginable. The general's reactions were a study in human response. Some shifted uneasily in their chairs, imagining themselves in her place, grappling with fear and responsibility under impossible circumstances. Others sat silently, absorbing each word, their respect deepening with every detail. The colonel, who had first recognized the medal, watched her closely, jaw tight, eyes reflecting an understanding that went beyond protocol or hierarchy. He realized that Maria Alvarez, standing before them in an apron and uniform, had survived situations that few could even comprehend, and she had done so with unwavering courage. "I don't understand how you made it through," one general finally admitted, voice low, almost incredulous. Maria paused, considering her words. "You don't make it through," she said quietly. "Not fully. You survive. You endure. You carry the memories, the weight, the guilt. You move forward because you have to, because someone else is still alive who needs you." She looked at each man at the table, seeing their reactions: shock, awe, hesitation. Recognition finally had taken root, but it was tempered by the stark reality of what she had experienced. The colonel leaned back slightly, running a hand across his jaw. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked, genuine curiosity and respect mingled in his tone. Maria smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. "Because I didn't want to. Because I wasn't the only one. Because courage isn't about medals or recognition. It's about what you do when no one is watching, when the only thing that matters is survival." She adjusted her posture, feeling the weight of their attention settle on her like a tangible presence. The cafeteria had become a theater for truth, and she was both the narrator and the hero. Her mind drifted briefly to her comrades, the men she had saved and those she had lost. Their faces, etched into memory, lent gravity to her words. She remembered Sergeant Miller's deep laugh, the young private's wide-eyed fear, the corporal who had whispered thanks even as blood poured from a wound. The generals, for the first time, seemed to understand that valor was not measured by rank or public recognition. It was measured by the choices one made in impossible moments. Maria's story, once invisible, now illuminated the cafeteria like sunlight through smoke. The other generals shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the woman they had dismissed was someone they could never underestimate again. They had spoken freely about operations, logistics, and strategy just moments ago, but now they were confronted with a living embodiment of battlefield heroism. Maria's modesty, her quiet demeanor, contrasted sharply with the chaos and danger she had endured, and that contrast only deepened their awe. Some whispered questions to each other, asking for clarifications, seeking context, yet all of them were careful not to interrupt the cadence of her narrative. "I can't even imagine," one general finally said, voice hushed. Maria's gaze met his, steady and unwavering. "You don't have to," she replied. "What matters is what you do with the knowledge that courage exists, often unseen. That bravery doesn't always come with accolades. That the world doesn't notice until it chooses to." Her tone was calm, yet every word carried the weight of experience. She was no longer a cafeteria worker. She was a storyteller, a soldier, a witness to the extremes of human courage. A subtle shift occurred in the room. The generals, previously aloof, now leaned forward, their authority tempered by the reality of what they were hearing. Maria saw nods of respect, murmured acknowledgments, and a tangible reverence that had been absent before. She had expected nothing, yet now she was being recognized, not for serving lunch, not for appearing competent in a mundane task, but for her lived experience, the courage and endurance that could not be faked or fabricated. Even as she recounted the convoy ambush, Maria remained acutely aware of her surroundings. She saw the subtle reactions, the tightening of hands around coffee cups, the slight stiffening of posture, the shared glances that conveyed a silent agreement. This woman had endured what they could not imagine. She spoke without dramatization, yet every gesture, every word, resonated with authenticity. Her narrative carried the rhythm of battle, abrupt, intense, and impossible to ignore. By the time she finished, the room had transformed. The general's perception of her, once indifferent, had shifted irrevocably. "You've carried this all alone?" the colonel asked finally, voice barely above a whisper. Maria nodded. "Not alone," she corrected softly. "I carried them, the ones I could save, and remembered the ones I couldn't. That is the weight I bear." Her eyes scanned the table, seeing a mixture of respect, curiosity, and subdued humility. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt seen not for her appearance, her apron, or her role, but for the courage that had always defined her. A faint smile crossed her lips. She had never sought recognition. She had survived for others, for duty, for survival itself. Yet acknowledgment, when it came, carried a strange warmth, a reassurance that her past mattered, that the sacrifices had not been invisible. The generals, now fully attentive, were learning something fundamental. Bravery is not always announced. It does not always shine in medals or accolades. Sometimes it waits quietly beneath the surface, revealed only when someone looks closely enough to notice. The colonel's gaze lingered on the faint glimmer of the silver star beneath her uniform. "You're remarkable," he said simply, the words carrying a sincerity that left Maria momentarily breathless. She inclined her head slightly, accepting the compliment without embellishment. It was not about pride. It was about recognition, validation of experiences that had remained largely unseen. The cafeteria, once mundane and routine, had become a stage for truth, and she had stood firmly at its center. The generals murmured among themselves, exchanging quiet observations and questions, yet none dared challenge the authority of her story. Each sentence Maria spoke was a testament, each detail a confirmation of valor that transcended the ordinary expectations of military rank. Her modesty, her quiet demeanor, amplified the impact of every revelation. By the time she set her tray down and stepped back, a profound shift had occurred. She was no longer invisible. She was acknowledged, understood, and respected in a way that transcended mere formalities. As Maria retreated to the kitchen, hands trembling slightly from the intensity of the moment, she allowed herself a deep breath. Recognition was not the goal, never had been. Yet now, for the first time, she felt a bridge form between her past and the present. The general's eyes, once indifferent, had seen her, and that mattered more than any medal, any ceremony, or any title. She had survived hell, carried others through fire, and now she was finally understood. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the faint, warm glow of justice. The hum of the cafeteria felt different now. Maria Alvarez moved through the space with the same practiced precision, but something had shifted. Where once she had been invisible, now she carried an invisible weight, a mixture of recognition, anticipation, and the delicate tension of having her past finally seen. The generals who had noticed the faint glimmer of the silver star lingered in their seats longer than usual, casting occasional glances toward her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and newfound respect. For Maria, every second was a reminder that her life, once overlooked, was being acknowledged. After the lunch rush, the colonel who had first recognized the medal found her stacking trays near the kitchen counter. His presence made her pause, hands hovering over a pile of plates, heart quickening. "Maria," he said, voice low but firm, carrying the kind of weight that demanded attention. "I want to hear more. If you're willing, Tell me everything. Not just fragments, not just the summary. The full story. Maria met his gaze, aware of the intensity behind the request. This was no casual curiosity. It was a rare acknowledgement of her experience, and she felt the familiar tension of expectation. She nodded, swallowing the lump that formed in her throat. The kitchen was empty now, the clatter of trays and chatter of soldiers reduced to a quiet hum. Standing there, apron tied neatly, she felt a rush of memories flood back. The desert heat, the acrid smoke, the wail of mortally wounded soldiers. "It's not easy to talk about," she began, voice steady despite the tremor beneath. "It was 2006, in Iraq. We were moving in convoy at dawn when the first IED detonated. The lead vehicle was destroyed instantly. Soldiers were pinned, injured, trapped. Each word she spoke carried weight, the cadence of her sentences echoing the rhythm of life and death she had once known. The colonel listened silently, his eyes narrowing slightly as he visualized the scene she described. Maria recounted the chaos of bullets flying past, the heat of burning vehicles, the screams of the wounded, and the desperate, unrelenting drive to save lives. She described the moment Sergeant Miller had been pinned under a Humvee, the weight of his body nearly too much to lift, the flames licking her hands as she pulled him free. She described Private Hernandez, eyes wide with terror, clinging to her as she carried him to safety. Every detail, precise and deliberate, painted the picture of a hero forged in fire. "6 men survived because of you," the colonel said quietly, voice heavy with awe. Maria nodded, swallowing the memories that threatened to choke her. "I did what I had to do," she said, voice calm. "The rest weren't as lucky." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken grief. The colonel leaned back, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. He had expected a story of bravery, but what he heard was more than that raw, unvarnished truth. Her courage was not performative. It was a daily, brutal reality, and it had remained invisible for too long. "I want to make sure your story is known," he said finally, after a long pause. Maria felt a jolt of apprehension. Recognition had never been her goal, and yet the idea of being honored, not for appearance, but for truth, stirred something deep within her. "I don't know if I want that," she admitted softly. "It's not about me. It's about the men I couldn't save, the ones I carried, the ones who relied on me." Her voice wavered slightly, revealing a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself to show. The colonel regarded her carefully. "I understand," he said gently. "But this isn't just about you. It's about inspiration. It's about teaching younger soldiers that courage exists in places they might overlook. That heroism isn't always visible until someone takes the time to notice." He paused, eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. "You have a responsibility, Maria, not because you want recognition, but because your story can teach, guide, and honor the sacrifices of all who served with you." She considered his words, letting them settle. Recognition was foreign to her. Applause, medals, and ceremonies had once felt hollow, distant echoes compared to the real, immediate work of saving lives. Yet the colonel's words carried truth. Her experiences could inspire, could validate, could ensure that sacrifices weren't forgotten. Slowly she nodded, a decision forming in the quiet of the empty kitchen. She would share her story, but on her terms, with authenticity and with respect for those who had not survived. The first step came subtly. Over the next few days, the colonel made quiet inquiries, speaking with other officers, coordinating with public affairs, and ensuring that Maria's heroism could be acknowledged without turning her into a spectacle. Maria continued her work in the cafeteria, but the atmosphere had changed. Soldiers who once ignored her now cast glances of curiosity and admiration. Young recruits whispered to one another, trying to catch a glimpse of the woman who had endured hell and returned unbroken. The generals, too, treated her differently, offering polite nods and casual words of respect. Maria found herself grappling with emotions she had long buried. Pride, which had always felt inappropriate, surfaced in small, subtle ways. Relief, true relief that her sacrifices had not been entirely invisible. And grief, persistent and unyielding, reminding her of the comrades she had lost. Each day, as she carried trays of food and refilled coffee cups, she balanced the ordinary demands of her work with the extraordinary weight of recognition slowly creeping into her life. It was a delicate dance, one that required every ounce of her discipline and focus. One afternoon, the colonel returned, carrying a small envelope. He approached Maria quietly, speaking low to avoid the attention of nearby soldiers. "This is preliminary," he said. "Just a note, some details about an internal recognition. Nothing public yet. But I wanted you to see it first." Maria took the envelope with trembling hands, the weight of the moment pressing down. Inside, she found formal language detailing her actions, acknowledging her courage, and recognizing her silver star. The words were precise, measured, yet carried a power she had not anticipated. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She had lived through horrors that defied words, yet here, in a quiet moment in the kitchen, words had found her. Recognition was not applause, not ceremony, not fleeting admiration. It was validation of truth. The colonel watched her carefully, understanding the subtle transformation occurring. Maria's posture, once rigid and controlled, softened slightly. Her gaze, usually fixed on tasks and movements, lingered on the envelope in her hands. She felt seen, understood, and for the first time in years, genuinely acknowledged. As the days passed, the internal recognition began to ripple outward. Soldiers shared whispers in hallways, recounting the story of the woman who had saved 6 lives under fire. Young recruits approached her with quiet questions, eager to learn from someone who had experienced war firsthand. The cafeteria, once a place of anonymity and routine, became a subtle stage of heroism. Maria continued her work with steady hands, balancing trays and serving meals, yet every action carried the newfound weight of respect. She was no longer merely a server, she was a living testament to courage, endurance, and survival. One evening, after the base had quieted, the colonel approached Maria again. "We're preparing something more formal," he said, voice low, confidential. "Not for show, not for politics, but to honor you and the men you saved. You've earned it. And it's time they all know." Maria hesitated, considering the implications. Public acknowledgement was foreign, even intimidating. Yet the idea of sharing her story, ensuring that the sacrifices of her comrades were remembered, outweighed her personal discomfort. Slowly, she nodded. "I'll do it," she said, voice firm, carrying the weight of responsibility. That night, Maria lay awake, the quiet hum of the base outside her window contrasting sharply with the memories that flooded her mind. Explosions, screams, fire, and blood, the sensory remnants of Iraq, intertwined with the anticipation of recognition she had long resisted. She thought of the soldiers who had survived because of her actions, and of those who had not. Her journey had always been about survival, discipline, and responsibility. Now it included something new, validation. And though recognition was not her goal, she understood that her story had the power to inspire, to teach, and to honor the fallen. By the following week, small but significant changes began to take shape. The internal recognition process moved forward, carefully coordinated by the colonel and public affairs officers. Maria remained focused on her duties in the cafeteria, carrying trays and pouring coffee with precision, but her colleagues treated her differently. Generals greeted her with respect, soldiers whispered encouragement, and the air buzzed with quiet admiration. Maria walked among them with the same discipline and quiet dignity she had always maintained. But now, Each step was infused with subtle confidence, the confidence of someone finally seeing. And still, she carried the weight of her past. Even in recognition, she was haunted by memories of fire, blood, and loss. The silver star beneath her uniform was not just a medal, it was a symbol of lives saved, sacrifices endured, and courage tested under extreme conditions. Her story was no longer invisible, yet it retained the solemn gravity of experience. Recognition, she realized, was not about personal glory. It was about ensuring that heroism, even when quiet and unseen, would be remembered and honored. In those quiet moments between serving meals, Maria allowed herself brief reflections. She had survived, endured, and persisted when the world seemed indifferent. Now, slowly, the world was catching up. The generals who had ignored her presence were witnesses to her truth. Young recruits were learning that courage did not require rank or visibility. It required action, integrity, and the willingness to risk everything for others. And for Maria, that recognition, subtle yet profound, was a long overdue acknowledgement of a life defined by bravery, resilience, and unyielding humanity. The days following the colonel's acknowledgement passed with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the air around Maria Alvarez. The cafeteria, once a place where she moved like a shadow, had become a stage of subtle recognition. Soldiers and officers who had ignored her presence now glanced with curiosity, awe, and even reverence. Each polite nod, each careful "thank you," carried weight. Maria moved among them with the same disciplined efficiency, yet a small, unfamiliar spark of pride lit her eyes. She had survived countless battles, yet the war to be seen and acknowledged had been the most delicate one of all. The internal recognition had begun to ripple outward. The colonel had quietly briefed senior staff, emphasizing that Maria's story was not a tale of self-glorification, but of lived heroism, bravery under fire, and unyielding commitment to others. Slowly, whispers spread across the base. Soldiers spoke of her courage in low tones, like secrets too important to share openly, stories that demanded respect rather than casual chatter. Young recruits, wide-eyed and impressionable, approached her cautiously, asking questions with hushed tones about her experiences, eager to understand the reality of war from someone who had lived it. Maria was cautious in her responses. She had learned that words could never fully convey the intensity of combat, the sheer chaos of life and death. Yet she spoke carefully, sharing fragments of her experiences, lessons in discipline, situational awareness, courage, and endurance. Each story she recounted carried weight, not for drama, but for authenticity. Soldiers listened intently, hanging on every word, realizing that bravery was not defined by rank, by medals, or by appearances, but by action in the face of unimaginable danger. Maria's influence began to seep subtly into the culture of the base, inspiring respect and quiet admiration. Even the generals who had first noticed her medal began to treat her differently. Casual conversations were replaced with deliberate engagement. Officers who had once dismissed her presence now sought her perspective, sometimes quietly, sometimes more openly. She was invited to training discussions, her observations valued for their grounded practicality. Her status, once confined to serving meals, had begun to shift toward that of a respected advisor. And yet Maria carried this newfound acknowledgement with careful humility. Recognition had arrived, but it was never about ego. It was about ensuring that courage, often unseen, was respected and remembered. The transformation was not without its challenges. Some soldiers, initially unaware of her past, felt a subtle tension between admiration and jealousy. They struggled to reconcile the woman who had served them lunch with the hero who had saved lives in combat. Maria navigated these complexities with the same careful observation she had learned in battle. She remained approachable but firm, open but discerning, maintaining her discipline while allowing the quiet acknowledgement of her heroism to take root organically. She had survived chaos abroad. She could navigate social complexity at home. One morning, as she carried trays to a table of senior officers, the colonel intercepted her quietly. "There's a small ceremony being organized," he said, voice low and confidential. "Nothing public yet, but internal recognition. I wanted to let you know first." Maria paused, balancing the trays, heart quickening. "A ceremony?" she asked softly. The word felt strange, almost foreign. Recognition had never been her goal. She had survived for duty, for others, for life itself. Yet the idea that her actions might be honored, even quietly, stirred a mixture of apprehension and cautious pride. "Yes," the colonel replied. "It's about acknowledging your courage, your discipline, and the lives you saved. You've earned this, Maria, not for show, not for applause, but because it matters that your story is known and remembered." She nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the words. Recognition, she realized, was not about her alone. It was about validation of truth, respect for sacrifice, and the preservation of memory. It was about the men who had survived, and those who had not. And for the first time, she allowed herself a fleeting sense of satisfaction. The ceremony was modest but poignant. Held in the base's conference hall, it was attended by a handful of officers, senior staff, and a select group of soldiers. Maria, in her plain uniform, stood quietly at the front, her silver star glinting faintly beneath her sleeve. The colonel spoke first, detailing her actions during the convoy ambush with precision and reverence. As he spoke, Maria's pulse quickened, memories of burning vehicles, screams, and chaos flooding her mind. Yet she remained composed, letting the words serve as a bridge between her hidden past and the audience before her. When it was her turn to speak, Maria's voice was steady, calm, yet infused with the weight of experience. She spoke of the convoy, the soldiers she had saved, and those she could not. She avoided dramatization, focusing on truth, integrity, and the lessons she had learned. "Courage is not about medals or recognition," she said softly, eyes sweeping the room. "It's about what you do when no one is watching, when lives depend on your choices, and when every second matters." Heroism is often quiet, invisible, and demanding, yet it defines who we are. The room was silent, each person absorbing the gravity of her words. Young recruits, seated in the back, listened intently, absorbing lessons they would carry for the rest of their careers. Officers and generals who had once dismissed her presence now looked upon her with profound respect. It was a subtle, transformative moment. Recognition had moved from private acknowledgement to collective awareness. Maria's story had begun to alter perceptions, influence behavior, and redefine heroism on the base. After the ceremony, soldiers approached Maria cautiously, offering quiet congratulations. Some simply shook her hand, while others asked thoughtful questions about her experiences. Her story had become a living lesson, a touchstone for courage, resilience, and integrity. She remained humble, deflecting praise while allowing the acknowledgement to take root. The cafeteria, once a place of invisibility, had become a subtle hub of inspiration. Maria's presence carried weight, not because she sought it, but because her actions had always demanded recognition. Even in private moments, Maria felt the subtle shift within herself. The long months of invisibility, the quiet labor, and the unacknowledged courage had weighed heavily on her. Now, recognition, both quiet and deliberate, had begun to lift that burden. She moved through her days with a sense of quiet purpose, balancing routine duties with the weight of being seen. Her training, her discipline, and her endurance had prepared her for chaos abroad. They now guided her through the delicate complexities of recognition, respect, and subtle leadership. The ripple effects extended further. The colonel continued to advocate for her, ensuring that her story was preserved internally documented for training, and subtly shared as an example of valor, integrity, and resilience. Soldiers in training were taught to respect courage in all its forms, to recognize that heroism was not always visible, and that the quietest figures often carried the heaviest burdens. Maria's story became an unspoken standard, a quiet benchmark for bravery that transcended rank, position, and routine expectations. Even as recognition spread, Maria remained cautious. She knew that attention could be fleeting, and that admiration could fade as quickly as it arrived. Yet she also recognized that her presence, her story, and her lived experience carried lasting influence. She had survived war, trauma, and invisibility. She had endured without expectation of acknowledgement. Now, recognition was not an obligation, it was validation, respect, and a reminder that courage, even when quiet, mattered. One evening, after the base had quieted, Maria stood near the kitchen window, gazing out at the fading light over the parade grounds. The desert beyond the fences glowed in shades of amber and gold. She reflected on the changes that had swept through her life since the recognition began. She had been invisible for too long, overlooked in a world that rarely acknowledged quiet heroism. Now she was seen. She was understood. And though the weight of past experiences remained, it was tempered by validation and respect that had long been denied. Maria touched the faint glimmer of her silver star beneath her uniform, a small but potent symbol of survival, courage, and recognition. She had endured chaos abroad and invisibility at home. Now she carried acknowledgement without losing humility, respect without seeking glory, and influence without arrogance. The cafeteria, once a place of mundane routine, had become a nexus of recognition, inspiration, and subtle transformation. Her story was no longer invisible. It had begun to ripple outward, altering perceptions, inspiring action, and honoring the sacrifices of all who had served beside her. And as she returned to her duties, carrying trays and pouring coffee, Maria felt a quiet but profound shift within herself. Recognition, once foreign and unexpected, had become a catalyst for change, both within her and across the base. She moved with the same disciplined grace as always, yet each step now carried the weight of acknowledgement, the affirmation of courage, and the knowledge that her story mattered. In the quiet, fluorescent-lit cafeteria, Maria Alvarez had emerged from invisibility into a subtle but undeniable prominence, a living testament to the endurance of heroism, integrity, and resilience. The ripple of recognition had grown louder. What had begun as private acknowledgement among the generals and a quiet ceremony within the base now extended outward, gradually threading its way through broader circles of military personnel. Maria Alvarez, who had spent months moving invisibly through the cafeteria, now felt the first tremors of wider attention. Soldiers whispered her story in training halls. Young recruits shared her courage with hesitant awe, and officers spoke of her valor in informal briefings. The world she had inhabited, ordinary, predictable, quiet, was beginning to shift beneath her feet. At first, Maria tried to ignore the change. She returned to her routines, carrying trays and refilling coffee with precise, disciplined motions, careful not to let the growing attention disrupt her work. But she noticed the subtle shifts in behavior, eyes following her movements, conversations pausing as she walked past, curious glances from people she did not know. For someone who had lived much of her life in invisibility, this scrutiny was both unfamiliar and unsettling. Her instinct was to retreat, to maintain control over her environment. Yet she could not deny the quiet pride stirring within her. The first overt challenge came in the form of a journalist sent by the base's public affairs office. The colonel had requested her cooperation in a small, internal feature meant to document exemplary service for archival purposes. The journalist arrived with a notebook and camera, polite and professional. But Maria felt the familiar tension of being under observation. "I don't usually do interviews," she said cautiously, eyes steady on the notebook. The journalist smiled warmly, understanding but insistent. "We just want to document your story, your courage, for historical records and internal inspiration. Nothing more." Maria agreed, but she maintained boundaries, controlling every word and detail shared. She recounted the convoy ambush with clarity, focusing on the actions, the principles, and the lessons learned rather than the sensationalized horror. She emphasized teamwork, responsibility, and the need to act under pressure. The journalist took meticulous notes, capturing her words with precision. But Maria's control over the narrative ensured that her story remained truthful, humble, and meaningful. It was recognition on her terms, allowing her courage to shine without becoming a spectacle. As the feature circulated internally, the ripple effect expanded. Soldiers approached her with questions, seeking guidance, clarification, or simply to hear her story again. Some officers requested informal briefings to learn about leadership under pressure, crisis management, and composure in the face of adversity. Maria responded with measured clarity, her presence a quiet force of authority that demanded respect without overt assertion. She began to realize that her recognition had shifted her role entirely from unnoticed cafeteria worker to a subtle but influential teacher and mentor. Yet with visibility came tension. Some personnel questioned why attention was being given to someone they had previously dismissed. A few whispers carried undertones of skepticism or envy, challenging Maria's newfound prominence. She felt the pull of discomfort, aware that recognition, however deserved, could provoke judgment or resentment. Her response was the same she had cultivated in combat: measured observation, controlled action, and unwavering focus. She carried her courage and humility as armor, letting her actions speak louder than words. One afternoon, the colonel approached her quietly as she wiped down a counter. "Maria," he said, voice low but firm, "your story has reached beyond our base. The headquarters wants to formally recognize you. There may be a ceremony, and potentially a wider acknowledgement in military channels." Maria felt her pulse quicken. Recognition on this scale was unfamiliar, almost intimidating. "I don't know if I want that," she admitted softly. "I've never sought attention. My work, my courage, was for the men I served with, not for recognition." The colonel regarded her with understanding, a slight nod of empathy. "I know," he said. "But sometimes the courage of one person can inspire many. Your story can teach leadership, resilience, and integrity to people who might never otherwise encounter it. Recognition isn't about glory, it's about impact, legacy, and ensuring that sacrifices are remembered." Maria considered his words. She had survived the chaos of war, navigated years of invisibility, and endured grief for the fallen. Now, recognition was not just validation, it was responsibility. The decision weighed heavily on her. She thought of Sergeant Miller, Private Hernandez, and the others whose lives had intertwined with hers in moments of extreme danger. Recognition could honor them too, preserving the memory of sacrifices that had been long overlooked. Slowly, she nodded, a quiet resolve forming within her. "I'll do it," she said, voice steady. "Not for me, but for them. For the men who were there, and for those who couldn't come home." Preparations began. The base organized a modest but significant ceremony, coordinating with higher headquarters to ensure her story would be documented and honored appropriately. Invitations were extended to key personnel, soldiers, and officers, but Maria maintained strict control over what was shared and how. She insisted on authenticity, focusing on the lessons, the teamwork, and the courage that had defined her actions, rather than seeking dramatization or self-aggrandizement. Every detail was deliberate, controlled, and carefully curated to reflect the truth of her experiences. As the day of the ceremony approached, Maria felt a mixture of anticipation and tension. Recognition, long delayed, was now inevitable, and she had no choice but to confront the attention that came with it. She walked through the base, observing the subtle changes in behavior. Soldiers and officers offering quiet nods of respect, young recruits whispering questions, and even casual conversations pausing briefly as she passed. For the first time, she understood the power of visibility, not fame, not applause, but acknowledgement that could inspire, educate, and honor the past. The ceremony itself was intimate but poignant. Held in the base auditorium, it included officers, soldiers, and select personnel who had witnessed her work firsthand. Maria stood at the front, silver star glinting faintly beneath her uniform. Hands steady, gaze unwavering. The colonel spoke first, detailing her bravery, her actions during the convoy ambush, and the lives she had saved. The room listened in silence, the weight of her courage hanging in the air. Every word validated the long months of invisibility, the quiet labor, and the unspoken sacrifices she had endured. When Maria spoke, her voice was calm, precise, and measured. She recounted the convoy ambush, focusing on the principles that had guided her: duty, discipline, courage, and responsibility. She emphasized teamwork, resilience, and the importance of selflessness. Her words carried authority, yet were free from ego. Soldiers and officers alike listened intently, absorbing lessons that transcended rank, role, or title. Maria's story had become a living template for courage, integrity, and leadership, resonating across generations of military personnel. By the end of the ceremony, the room was filled with quiet admiration and subtle reverence. Recognition, long withheld, had transformed into validation, education, and inspiration. Maria's story had reached beyond her immediate environment, impacting soldiers, officers, and leadership alike. She returned to her daily routines in the cafeteria, carrying trays and pouring coffee, but the subtle weight of respect and acknowledgement followed her. Her presence had shifted from invisible background figure to a quiet but undeniable force within the base, influencing behavior, perceptions, and morale. Even as recognition expanded, Maria remained grounded. She had survived combat, grief, and years of invisibility. Fame or attention was never the goal. She had endured for duty, for others, and for survival itself. Now, her story carried the power to inspire, educate, and honor those who had been lost. She moved with the same disciplined grace, but each step now bore the subtle confidence of someone whose courage had been witnessed, validated, and respected. The ripple of acknowledgement continued to grow. Soldiers sought her advice, officers requested informal consultations, and the base culture subtly shifted toward respect for invisible courage. Maria Alvarez, once overlooked, had become a quiet symbol of resilience, heroism, and integrity. Recognition was no longer private, it was institutional, documented, and remembered. Yet through it all, she remained herself, disciplined, humble, and focused, ensuring that her story honored the men she had saved, the sacrifices endured, and the enduring power of courage. The weeks after the base ceremony carried an air of quiet transformation. Maria Alvarez, once the invisible woman serving lunch trays, had become something larger than herself. Her story was no longer confined to whispered conversations or hushed admiration among soldiers. It had begun to ripple through official channels, reaching audiences far beyond the walls of the cafeteria. The public affairs article had circulated across military networks, sparking discussions in training academies and leadership courses. For the first time in years, Maria's courage was not only acknowledged, it was studied, honored, and preserved. Headquarters extended an invitation. A national recognition event was being planned, not a spectacle of pomp, but a formal acknowledgement of heroism, resilience, and service. Maria was hesitant. She had never craved attention, The battlefield had taught her the cost of visibility, and the cafeteria had reinforced the quiet power of anonymity. But the colonel's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the courage of one person can inspire many. She understood now that her story was not only hers. It belonged to every soldier who had endured, every comrade lost, every act of unseen bravery. When the day arrived, Maria stood before a packed hall in Washington, D.C. The room was filled with military leaders, veterans, cadets, and dignitaries. Photographs of soldiers lined the walls, reminding everyone present that recognition was about sacrifice, not self. Dressed in her uniform, silver star gleaming proudly on her chest, Maria walked with the same disciplined calm she had carried since the battlefield. Yet inside, her heart raced. She had faced bullets, fire, and chaos without hesitation. But standing before a sea of eyes being truly seen was a battle of its own. The ceremony began with speeches from senior officers. They spoke of Maria's convoy ambush, her life-saving actions, and the resilience she carried long after combat. Her name was spoken with reverence, her story described as a testament to the invisible courage that too often went unnoticed. As Maria listened, she thought of the men she had saved and those she could not. Their faces flickered in her memory, vivid and haunting. She gripped the edge of the podium, grounding herself, reminding her heart that this honor was for them as much as for her. When her turn came, Maria stepped forward. The hall hushed. Her voice was steady, calm, deliberate. "I never sought recognition," she began. "On that day, when our convoy was attacked, there was no time for glory, only choices. Choices that meant life or death for the men beside me. I acted because it was my duty, because they were my brothers, and because courage is never about being noticed. It's about doing what must be done when everything is on the line." She paused, her eyes sweeping the hall, resting briefly on the young cadets in uniform. Heroism is not loud. It's not about medals or ceremonies or standing on a stage. It's about moments no one sees, the decision to hold steady, to risk everything, to endure. The men I served with taught me that. Some came home, some did not. Today is not just about me. It's about them. It's about every soldier whose courage was never spoken of, whose bravery lives quietly in memory. The silence in the hall was profound. No applause erupted immediately, no outburst of noise. Instead, the audience absorbed her words with reverence, as though her presence itself carried the weight of all the unseen sacrifices of war. When the applause finally came, it was slow, deliberate, rising like a wave of respect rather than excitement. Maria bowed her head slightly, humility etched in every movement. The silver star on her chest glimmered faintly, but it was no longer just hers. It was a symbol for countless others who had endured invisibly. After the ceremony, Maria met with cadets and young officers. They asked questions not about tactics, but about courage, resilience, and the reality of leadership under fire. She spoke to them with quiet authority, each word deliberate. Courage, she told them, is not the absence of fear, it's action in spite of it. Discipline is what carries you when fear threatens to take over. And humility keeps you grounded, reminding you that you serve something larger than yourself. Her words, carried with the weight of lived truth, became lessons the cadets would carry into their own futures. Beyond the hall, her story spread further. News outlets picked up the feature, framing her not as a celebrity, but as a soldier whose humility embodied the true spirit of service. Veterans wrote letters, thanking her for giving voice to their own invisible sacrifices. Families of fallen soldiers reached out, grateful that she had honored their loved ones in her speech. Maria found herself at the center of a movement she had never intended to start, a movement that reminded people that true heroism often lived quietly, unnoticed, but no less powerful. Despite the attention, Maria remained unchanged in her essence. She returned to her base, resumed her duties, and continued serving meals with the same disciplined grace. Soldiers now greeted her with respect, not pity or dismissal. Conversations in the cafeteria carried a new weight, as if her presence reminded everyone that greatness could emerge from the most ordinary of places. Maria smiled sometimes, quietly, knowing that visibility had not stripped her of her humility. It had strengthened it. Late one evening, after the day's duties were done, Maria walked alone across the quiet parade ground. The night sky stretched endlessly above, stars scattered like fragments of memory. She thought of Sergeant Miller, Private Hernandez, and others who had not returned. She touched the metal pinned to her uniform, feeling the cool metal against her skin. It was heavy, not with pride, but with responsibility, a responsibility to remember, to honor, to continue serving, even when the world was no longer watching. She realized then that recognition had never been about her. It had always been about them, the soldiers beside her, the lives saved, the sacrifices made. Her visibility was not a personal triumph, but a vessel for remembrance, a way to ensure that courage, even in its quietest form, would never be forgotten. In that moment, Maria understood her place in the larger story of service, not as a symbol of glory, but as a guardian of memory. The cafeteria would always be her stage, the soldiers her audience. Yet beyond the trays and the steaming coffee, she had become something else, entirely a quiet force, a living reminder of the unseen sacrifices that defined true heroism. Maria Alvarez, once invisible, had emerged not into fame, but into legacy. Her name, her story, and her humility would echo long after the applause had faded, carried in the hearts of those she had inspired. As she turned back toward the lights of the base, a faint smile touched her lips. The war had shaped her, invisibility had tested her, and recognition had transformed her. Now, she walked not as the woman who had been overlooked, but as the woman whose courage had been witnessed, honored, and preserved. Her journey was complete, not because she was seen, but because she had ensured that others would never be forgotten. And in that quiet moment beneath the stars, Maria Alvarez finally felt at peace.